In March 1934, in the small town of Bethel, Connecticut, a Russian émigré named Rudolph Kunett opened the first vodka distillery in the history of the United States. His timing looked perfect. Prohibition had ended a few months earlier. For the first time in 13 years, Americans were legally allowed to drink, and they were making up for it. And Kunett was not selling some anonymous product. He held the American rights to the most famous name in Russian drink, a house that had supplied the court of the Tsar, won gold medals at world's fairs, and at its height produced bottles by the million. In his first year, he sold 1,200 cases. Most of them went to Russian and Polish immigrants living near the plant, people who already knew what the stuff was. Americans didn't. They were going back to whiskey, gin, and beer, and a clear liquid that tasted of nothing meant nothing to them. By 1938, Kunett couldn't afford the licenses he needed. He went to a small family firm down the road in Hartford, a company then staying alive largely on the strength of a single product, a steak sauce, and sold out. The man who bought it said years later, in as many words, that he never knew why he did it. Today that brand sells tens of millions of cases a year and is owned by a British multinational. It is, most years, the best-selling spirit in America. So here's the strange part. Nothing about the liquid changed. Same distillate, same bottle, same recipe. What changed was one sentence of advertising. That's the whole story of this drink in miniature. Because this colorless liquid, the most boring bottle on the shelf, the one you buy without reading the label, paid for fleets and wars. It propped up the entire budget of an empire for 4 centuries. It caused riots, executions, and one of the worst peacetime mortality crises of the 20th century. And it did all of that while being, by design, nothing at all. How did that happen? And what did it actually cost to make it that cheap? But this story doesn't start in Connecticut, or in Moscow, or in any snowbound tavern. It starts inside a word you already own. The word is whiskey. It comes from the Gaelic eau-de-vie, and eau-de-vie is a translation. The original is Latin aquavit, the water of life. Every language in Europe translated that same phrase, and before it was a drink at all, it was a promise. The claim that a human being had finally pulled the living principle out of dead matter. To understand why that promise set off 1,000 years of politics, you need one piece of physics first. The yeasts that turn sugar into alcohol are poisoned by their own product. Somewhere around 14 or 15%, the environment turns toxic and fermentation stops. That is the natural ceiling. Everything humanity drank for tens of thousands of years, beer, wine, mead, cider, hit that ceiling and stayed under it. Distillation breaks the ceiling. Alcohol boils at 78 degrees Celsius, water at 100. Heat the mixture, catch the first vapor, cool it down, and you have a liquid that does not occur in nature. Not a drink, a concentrate. And that is where everything else begins. Because a concentrate is not food. It's a compressed form. Think about what happens to a sack of grain. It's heavy, it's bulky, it gets damp, it molds, mice eat it, and on a bad road half the journey is paid for by the cart. Distill it, and the whole harvest becomes a few gallons of clear liquid that never spoils, never freezes, doesn't degrade with rough handling, divides into tiny portions, and finds a buyer in any weather, under any government. Salt, your body needs. Without sodium, you die, which is why salt had biology behind it. Vodka, your body does not need, in any quantity whatsoever. And that is the real trick of this story. Distilled spirit became indispensable, and not to people, but to states. Think for a moment about what a treasury wants from a perfect commodity. That everyone wants it. That they buy it regularly rather than once in a lifetime. That it's made in few enough places to be counted and sealed. That demand barely drops when the price goes up. And that the customer, once habituated, comes back on his own without anybody having to make him. Spirit satisfies all 5 conditions at once. That's its actual superpower, not intoxication. Taxability. Compare it with anything else. Tax bread and you have a hunger riot by the following week. Gold and furs pay well, but they're bought rarely, and not by everybody. Spirit is made in a few dozen stills, sealed, distributed, and charged for by the glass. Every day, all year, across every class simultaneously. A state that bets on this liquid doesn't acquire an industry. It acquires a tap. And the trouble with the tap is that once it's open, the state can no longer close it at will, because more than the treasury now depends on it. One last thing. Ethanol is a small molecule that slides through cell membranes and across the barrier that protects the brain. It needs no digestion, works in minutes, and hits the reward system directly. Our bodies can break it down. We have enzymes for it, inherited most likely from ancestors who scavenged fermenting fruit off the ground. We are biologically prepared for weak alcohol in small amounts. For 40% in a shot glass, we are not prepared at all. Hold on to that idea for the whole film. What follows is 1,000 years of 2 different uses of the same liquid. One of them was paid in money. The other was paid in people. And neither side could stop. Start with the alchemists. Distillation is much older than vodka. Crude stills existed in ancient Alexandria, used for perfumes, resins, and mercury. But the school that turned it into a serious craft was in the Islamic world. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, scholars including Jabir ibn Hayyan left the apparatus in working order: vessel, head, delivery tube, cooling. English keeps 2 fossils of that period, and almost nobody notices either. The first is alembic, from the Arabic al-anbik, the still head itself. The second is alcohol, from al-kul, which originally meant nothing like a drink. It was the fine powder of antimony used as eye cosmetic. The idea was of a substance ground to its uttermost fineness, reduced to its essence. From the powder, the word migrated to the volatile spirit of wine, which means alcohol literally means the finest part, what's left when you take everything else away. The name was coined centuries before anyone understood what they were naming. From Al-Andalus in southern Italy, the technique passed into European medicine. At Salerno in the 12th century, wine is already being distilled for cures. The great popularizer is a Catalan physician, Arnald of Villanova, who around the turn of the 14th century makes distilled spirit the star product of the European apothecary. And the name they gave it says everything. Aquavit, the water of life. That wasn't poetry, it was a diagnosis. Physicians saw a liquid that burned, disinfected wounds, drew the strength out of herbs, and revived the dying. In a world with no antibiotics, no anesthesia, and no concept of infection, that looked like a miracle. It was said to extend life, preserve youth, and cure melancholy. And that reputation, medicine, not pleasure, is what the technique carries north with it. For centuries, the stuff is sold in a pharmacy. Drinking it for fun would have seemed as odd as drinking iodine. Now notice a detail that will explain the rest of the film. The further north the technique travels and the later it arrives, the less medicine remains in it, and the more accounting. Because water of life isn't a name, it's a whole family of names. The French made eau-de-vie, the Scandinavians akvavit. Spain and the Americas got the most transparent version of all, aguardiente, burning water. And the Irish and Scots translated it into Gaelic as eau-de-vie, which wore down over the centuries into whiskey. All of Europe translating the same Latin phrase, and each getting its own national spirit. And Russia? Russia didn't translate it. Not water of life, not spirit of wine, not burning water. The grain distillate was called bread wine for centuries. Wine made from grain instead of grapes. And the word that would eventually beat every other name on earth originally meant something else entirely. It was what you called a medicinal tincture from a pharmacy. That word is a diminutive of the Russian for water. Not water of life. Little water. Sit with that contrast for a second because it's perfect. Europe named the drink after immortality. Russia named it with an affectionate diminutive, something domestic, ordinary, around the house. And that was the name that ended up circling the globe without needing translation. For that little water to exist, though, you needed three things: surplus grain, a still, and somewhere people could read, write, and handle technology. In 15th century Russia, there was exactly one such place: the monastery. Monasteries weren't only houses of prayer. They were agricultural corporations with land, mills, workshops, granaries, books, and foreign contacts. They knew what to do with last year's grain, the grain that was going to spoil anyway, and they had the apparatus. There's a much-repeated legend that even supplies a name: a monk of the chewed-off monastery inside the Moscow Kremlin, supposedly producing the first grain distillate in the 1430s. It isn't documented, and almost all of the early history here is made of later guesswork. But the logic holds. The first Russian stills stood behind monastery walls, and what came out of them was something between a remedy and a way of saving the harvest. The Russian version came out different from the start. Not grapes, which don't grow there, but rye, the most reliable northern grain. Harsher, coarser, with a clear smell of bread. Distilled twice and 3 times, cut with water, steeped with herbs and berries to soften it. And strength wasn't measured with instruments, which didn't exist. It was measured with fire. You set a measured portion alight and watched how much burned off. If exactly half remained, the goods were sound. The Russian name for that standard meant roughly half burnt, about 38 or 39% in modern terms. Remember that number. We'll come back to it when it's time to take apart the most famous myth in this story. But while the monks are quietly distilling for the brethren and their guests, outside the walls, somebody is looking at that liquid differently. He doesn't pray and he doesn't drink. He counts. The conventional date for the first serious move is around 1478 under Ivan III, the Grand Prince who welded Moscow into a state and stopped paying tribute to the horde. He establishes a state monopoly on the production and sale of bread wine. Private persons forbidden to distill, forbidden to sell. Understand exactly what just happened, because it sets up the next 4 centuries. That is not a ban on alcohol. It's the precise opposite. The state doesn't take the drink away from you. It takes it for itself. Drinking, permitted. Distilling, no. Selling, the crown only. For the first time in this story, power isn't selling a product. It's selling a right. Control a few dozen stills, and you control the cash flow of an entire country. But a monopoly is only the mechanism. To run at full power, it needed one more part, a place. That part was supplied by Ivan IV, the one history calls the Terrible. On the most widely repeated account, returning from the Kazan campaign in the early 1550s, he ordered a particular kind of establishment opened in Moscow, the Tsar's Tavern. And in that tavern, no food was served. This is the heart of the invention, and there is nothing accidental about it. In an inn, people eat, drink slowly, and go home. In the Tsar's Tavern, there is only drink, and nothing to slow it down. The man who walks in doesn't eat, doesn't get distracted, doesn't get full. He drinks on an empty stomach, fast, until the money runs out. The men who ran these places were crown officers. The Russian title of one of the posts means literally, the one who kisses. He kissed the cross when he swore to serve the treasury honestly. He wasn't a publican. He was a public servant in charge of a cash box. And here's the detail that turns all of this into a machine. Those officers were held to a take that could not fall below last year's. If it came up short, they answered with their own property. So the state wasn't merely permitting people to be got drunk. It was making it a job requirement and punishing insufficient zeal. Picture that man's position. He has a shortfall owed to the crown and a family to feed. On the other side of the counter is a peasant who has already drunk his hat. And the only way for him not to be beaten himself is to pour another. That is the exact moment this story stops being about a beverage and becomes a story about the architecture of power. Everything was thought through, including the glassware. The unit the state counted in was a pail of about 12 liters. The unit the customer bought in was a tiny cup, and the entire profit lived between those two measures. So was the geography. Taverns were planted at river crossings, at fairs, beside markets. On the road a farmer walked home along after selling his harvest with a year's income in his pocket. Distilling for yourself, meanwhile, was a crime. By the 17th century, the machine is at full throttle, and it starts breaking people. Instructions to those crown officers include a phrase that raises the hair on your neck. Drinkers are not to be turned away from the tavern. Not discouraged, not limited, not sent home. Let them drink. Debts grew. A debt was answered for with goods. And then, with the body, there was a public beating of debtors until the family produced the money. Russian still keeps phrases from that era for a man who has drunk away everything down to the cross around his neck. It piled up for decades and burst in 1648. In Moscow came the revolt the books remember for the salt tax, but across those same years the country saw a wave of risings in which taverns were sacked alongside the houses of hated officials. People weren't only burning tax books, they were burning the tavern's debt ledgers, and the state got genuinely frightened. In 1652, a council met that history knows as the Tavern Council, with decisions close to revolutionary for the 17th century. One drinking house per town, no credit, no selling in Lent or on holy days, one ration per person, private tax farmers out. For the first time, a state honestly tried to restrain itself. It lasted about 10 years. By the early 1660s, the restrictions were dismantled one by one, and the credit came back. The reason wasn't moral, it was arithmetical. There was a long war, the treasury was empty, silver was so short the government tried circulating copper coin and earned itself another riot. Giving up the most reliable revenue in the state was simply not available. Now stop, because at this point the natural thought is that this is a Russian story, that we're talking about a national character, a climate, an Eastern European exception. It isn't. and the proof is in London. Because at the very moment Russian tavern keepers were being flogged over their quotas, the British government was running the same experiment, and running it, if anything, harder. It starts in the 1690s with two decisions that had nothing to do with drinking. England was at war with France, so French brandy was shut out. And Parliament, wanting to prop up grain prices for the landed interest, broke the old distilling monopoly and made it easy for anyone to distill from English corn. Read that again. Nobody set out to flood London with spirits. The government was protecting farmers' incomes and punishing a wartime enemy. Cheap gin was a side effect. And what a side effect. By the 1730s, consumption in London had reached something on the order of 2 pints of spirits a week for every man, woman, and child in the city. In 1749, there were reported to be over 17,000 places selling gin in London, and more than 4,000 people convicted for selling spirits without a license. This wasn't the fragrant botanical gin of a modern cocktail bar. It was a raw, throat-stripping industrial product, often adulterated, sold by the dram in doorways and back rooms. And here is the number that should stop you cold. By around 1730, the drinks trade, mostly through excise duties, accounted for roughly a quarter of the British government's annual revenue. Hold that figure. We'll meet it again in St. Petersburg, 180 years later, almost to the decimal. So Parliament did what governments do. It panicked and it prohibited. The Gin Act of 1736 imposed a punitive duty and a license fee of £50 a year, an impossible sum for a small seller, and offered rewards to informers. The result was exactly what you'd now predict: mass evasion, a violent black market, bribed inspectors, informers attacked in the street, and rioting. Within a few years, the fee and the duty had to be brought back down. What finally worked was the Act of 1751, and it worked because it did the opposite. It didn't ban. It restricted retail licenses to substantial, respectable premises, forbade distillers from supplying unlicensed sellers, and pushed drinking out of the doorways and into places somebody could be held responsible for. Duties rose gradually rather than punitively. Beer and tea were actively encouraged as alternatives. Bad harvests then raised grain prices and made landowners less dependent on gin money. 2 generations of catastrophe, and the lesson was, regulate the trade. Don't outlaw the thirst. That lesson was available, in print, in English, by 1751. Which makes what happened next in the newly independent United States all the more remarkable. In 1791, the government of a country 3 years old needed money. It had inherited enormous debts from its War of Independence, and Alexander Hamilton needed an internal revenue source that would actually produce. He chose distilled spirits. Of course he did. It's the same commodity for the same 5 reasons. Out on the western frontier, this landed very badly. For a farmer in western Pennsylvania, whiskey wasn't a luxury. It was how you got a crop to market. Grain over the mountains was almost worthless. Grain distilled into whiskey was compact, imperishable, tradable, and in practice served as local currency. Taxing it wasn't taxing a vice. It was taxing the only mechanism that turned a harvest into money. So they refused. Tax collectors were beaten, some tarred and feathered. Officials' houses were burned. By the summer of 1794, thousands of armed men had gathered outside Pittsburgh, and the response is one of the most extraordinary facts in early American history. President George Washington called out a federalized militia force of roughly 13,000 men comparable in size to the army he had commanded in the Revolution, and personally rode out at its head for part of the march. The only time a sitting American president has taken the field with an army, and it was against his own citizens, over a tax on distilled spirits. The rebellion collapsed without a battle. The tax was quietly repealed a few years later under Jefferson. 2 continents, 2 political systems, 1 commodity, and the identical sequence. A treasury reaches for spirits because nothing else pays as well, and then discovers that it has grabbed something alive. Back in Russia, that same tap was about to be opened wider. Peter I, the Tsar who westernized the country, mocked drunkenness savagely. He is credited with a cast-iron medal for drunkenness, some 7 kilos of it, hung around the offender's neck so he couldn't take it off, to be worn for weeks. And that same Peter built his navy on tavern money. Shipyards, cannon, a modern army, and a new capital raised out of a swamp cost sums the country did not have, and the drink revenue was one of the pillars of the Great Northern War budget. In 1716, he also gave the nobility freedom to distill. There's an entire era in one man. He hangs 7 kilos of iron on a drunk and simultaneously builds an empire on drinking. It isn't hypocrisy. He is the first to say the rules out loud, that a state needs sober soldiers and drinking taxpayers. Catherine II finished the job. In 1765, the right to distill is reserved exclusively to the nobility. And here comes a paradox almost nobody remembers. Noble distilling gave the Russian spirit its golden age. A landowner distilled not for sale, but for his own table, his guests, and his reputation. He could afford to run it 2 and 3 times, cut the heads and tails, filter through birch charcoal, milk, and egg white, then steep it with aniseed, caraway, mint, cherry stones. Wealthy houses kept alphabetical collections, a different infusion for every letter. There were named recipes, too, including one attributed to a barber who, by tradition, came back from a Russian mission to China with herb lore and cured an aristocrat his doctors had given up on. Legend or not, the point is this. Deep into the 18th century, strong spirit was still being sold with a story about healing rather than a story about a party. What that produced was an aromatic, soft, expensive drink, closer to a good cognac or a craft gin than to anything we call vodka now. And in the same years, in the tavern, they were pouring a cloudy, watered product that cost coppers and tore your throat. Same commodity, 2 different worlds. Refinement upstairs, a way of surviving until spring, downstairs. And that split explains the great misunderstanding about Russia. The country of the world describes as "those people drink" spent centuries as a place where the top drank beautifully and the bottom was sold a state-priced substitute. Because the bottom wasn't really being sold to by the Tsar anymore. It was being sold to by the tax farmer. The system was simple. The crown auctioned the right to sell drink in a territory for a term of years. Highest bidder won, paid up front, and then made his own arrangements. The arrangements were virtuosic. He watered the barrel. He short-poured the cup. He charged above the posted price. He ran unlicensed outlets. He crushed competitors through a police force that ate from his hand. And a peasant was tied to his own village's tavern and physically could not buy elsewhere. Fortunes on the scale of modern oil money came out of this. Vasily Kokorev was born into a modest provincial family, went into the drink farms, and within a few years was one of the richest men in Russia. Then he did what big money does. oil, railways, banking. He built a refinery near Baku before petroleum was the world's fuel, and opened in Moscow one of the country's first private galleries open to the public. Think about where that money came from. A short pour in a provincial tavern. By the late 1850s, the drink revenue was running at roughly a third of all state income. And then something happened that the system had made no provision for whatsoever. People stopped buying. In August 1858, in the western provinces, peasants began forming temperance societies. The idea was brilliantly simple. If we can't change the price, we can decline to pay it. A village assembly passed a binding resolution. No wine is taken here, and fined its own members for breaking it. It was contagious. By the summer of 1859, the movement covered more than 30 provinces and thousands of villages. In one district of Saratov province alone, nearly 5,000 people renounced alcohol. The tax farmers panicked. First they raised the price, then they started giving it away free, anything to restore the habit. It didn't work. And then patience ran out, and a wave of attacks on drinking houses swept the country. In one district, close to 40 taverns were destroyed. In one town, the crowd disarmed the police and opened the jail. Notice the detail that explains everything. When they broke into the taverns, people didn't drink the wine. They poured it on the ground. That's decisive. An ordinary hunger riot breaks into a warehouse to take. This broke in to destroy. Historians note there is virtually no documented theft in these attacks, and that the shortfalls, which later appeared in the accounts, were cheerfully blamed on the rioters by the drinkhouse's own staff. They weren't attacking property. They were attacking the mechanism holding them. And now the state's response, which is why this episode deserves to be remembered. Back in March of 1858, ministers had circulated instructions through their departments whose substance was this: temperance societies are not to be permitted to form, and village resolutions of abstinence already adopted are to be annulled. Read that sentence again. The government banned sobriety. Then came the punishment. Estimates of those brought before the courts run to around 11,000 people. There were floggings, exile, penal battalions. Villages were fined to rebuild the taverns they had destroyed. Made to pay, in other words, for having somewhere to ruin themselves again. Retired soldiers and officials who had joined in were stripped of rank. This was not a story about alcohol. It was a story about what happens when a population attacks a budget. Formally, the abstainers lost. In practice, they won. The farming system was so thoroughly discredited that in 1863 it was abolished and replaced with an excise on spirit produced. Now anyone who paid could distill. And at that moment, engineering enters the story and kills the flavor. Enter the rectifying column. Unlike a pot still, where alcohol and aromatic compounds rise together, a column separates them with almost surgical precision and yields spirit of extreme purity, essentially odorless, cheaply at industrial volume, from almost any raw material. The difference is enormous. Old bread wine had flavor. You could taste the grain, and it took skill. Rectified spirit has no flavor, by definition. And now the drink isn't distilled, it's calculated. Take spirit, add water, adjust the strength. Vodka, in the modern sense, is born right here, as a formula rather than a recipe. Not a food, a solution. Which brings us to the question everybody thinks they can answer. Why 40? The popular version says the ideal strength was worked out by the great chemist Dmitri Mendeleev. It sounds wonderful, it flatters national pride, and it has been circulating for over a century. The truth is duller and more interesting at once. Mendeleev's 1865 dissertation was indeed titled On the Combination of Alcohol with Water, and it genuinely was about alcohol-water mixtures. What it studied, though, were physical and chemical properties, density, the contraction of volume on mixing. There is not one line in it claiming 40% is optimal for drinking. He wasn't in the beverage business. The number came from bookkeeping. As early as the 1840s, when Mendeleev was about 9 years old, the authorities were setting a minimum legal strength for retail sale. Later, with hydrometers in general use, the finance ministry found it convenient to round the standard to a flat 40%. A round number makes the duty easier to calculate and fraud easier to catch. The norm went into the drink tax statutes and outlived the empire, the revolution, 2 world wars, and the Soviet Union. So 40% is not chemical harmony and not a genius's legacy. It's a tax inspector's convenience, frozen in glass. And if you want the proof, it's printed on the bottle in your own kitchen. Look at the word proof. It comes from a British customs test. Spirit strong enough to pass a specific check was proof spirit, and duty was assessed against it. Britain fixed proof to a hydrometer standard in 1816. The United States then defined its own version as a simple doubling. Degrees proof equals twice the percentage of alcohol, which is why an American bottle of vodka says 80 proof. 80 proof is 40%. That number on the label of a bottle bought in Ohio last week was chosen by a Russian finance ministry in the 19th century because it made the excise arithmetic tidy. 2 empires, 1 accounting convenience, and it's still on the glass. Meanwhile, one man had worked out that something new could be built on this tasteless liquid. A name. Pyotr Smirnov was born a serf. His family bought their freedom, moved to Moscow, went into the drink trade, and in the 1860s he opened his own business. Then he did what nobody in that industry had done. He bet on quality, while the whole sector competed on price. And in parallel, he advertised, before that word was in common use. He took his products to national and world exhibitions, collected medals, and printed them on the label. He pioneered charcoal filtration. He made everything from the cheap popular line to expensive infusions for the aristocracy. And he won the title of Purveyor to the Imperial Court, the state arms on the bottle, the best trademark money could buy in that country. By the end of the century, it was an empire worth millions, and the family name was a synonym for the product itself. And then the state decided it could do this itself. The reform was designed and executed by the finance minister Sergei Vita. From 1894, region by region, over several years, a state monopoly comes in. Private firms may produce the spirit, but rectification, bottling, and above all, retail are taken over by the crown. Taverns are replaced by state shops. Only sealed bottles are sold, at standard strength, under a government seal. The arguments were high-minded and partly fair. No more short measure, no more watered product, no more tavern credit, guaranteed quality. But the result was, before anything else, financial. By the early 20th century, the drink revenue supplied roughly a quarter of the budget's ordinary income. There's that fraction again. A quarter of the revenue of Georgian Britain. A quarter of the revenue of Imperial Russia. 2 states that had almost nothing in common arriving at the same number, because the mechanism, not the culture, sets it. The circle Ivan III had opened 4 centuries earlier was closed. The state was the only seller. And there is a detail here almost everyone skips. The monopoly changed not only who sold, but how people drank. Before, a man went into a tavern and asked for a cup, he drank on the premises, in measures, among other people. Now the state shop sold only a sealed bottle to take away, and drinking inside was forbidden. The effect was precisely the opposite of the intention. Having bought the bottle, a man took it round the corner, into an entryway, onto waste ground, and drank the whole thing, because there was no point resealing it and carrying it home. That is where the image the world would come to think of as quintessentially Russian was born. 3 strangers, 1 bottle, nothing to eat. The state wanted cleanliness and order. It got a clean product, an honest strength, a guaranteed measure, and a new, more destructive way of consuming it. 12 years later, it walked away from all of it in a week. In the summer of 1914, declaring mobilization, the Russian government banned the sale of strong drink, first for the duration of the call-up, then for the duration of the war. It was unprecedented. A country with a quarter of its budget resting on that bottle voluntarily switched off that income at the start of the most expensive war in its history. The first effects were astonishing. Arrests for drunkenness collapsed. Savings deposits rose. Contemporaries wrote about a sobriety never seen in the countryside. Then came the consequences nobody had costed. A hole the size of a ministry opened in the public finances and was plugged with debt and the printing press, which fed inflation and the collapse of the ruble. Demand, meanwhile, hadn't gone anywhere. Illicit distilling flourished, and with it, denatured alcohol, varnish, and pharmacy preparations. Poisonings became routine, and the enormous stocks of already produced spirit didn't vanish. They simply passed out of the law and out of control. And in 1917, when order came apart, those warehouses became a target for the crowd. Historians still argue about how much the dry law contributed to the empire's fiscal collapse, and there's no single answer. Too much converged at once. But one thing is clear. The country entered its revolution, formally sober and financially wrecked. And then, and this is the part that ought to be taught alongside it, the United States did the same thing. American Prohibition arrives in 1920, and it arrives on a fiscal foundation that is rarely mentioned. Before the First World War, alcohol taxes were a major pillar of federal revenue too. What changed was the 16th Amendment of 1913, which created the federal income tax. Only once Washington had another way to fund itself did banning the nation's drink become affordable. Prohibition, in other words, was made possible by a tax reform. What followed is familiar from the Russian script, only larger. Demand went underground. Bootlegging became a major industry, and because industrial alcohol had been legally denatured since 1906, poisoned with methanol and other chemicals so it could be sold untaxed, the syndicates simply stole it and hired chemists to make it drinkable again. Treasury officials estimated that by the mid-1920s, tens of millions of gallons of industrial alcohol were being diverted every year. So in 1926, the federal government escalated. It ordered the denaturing formulas made far more lethal. People began dying in numbers. In New York City, hospital wards filled at holidays with methanol poisoning. The city's chief medical examiner, Charles Norris, campaigned against the policy in blunt public language, calling it an experiment in extermination. The program stayed in place until Prohibition ended. Estimates of the death toll are necessarily rough because record-keeping was poor and many deaths were logged as something else, but the figure most often cited is at least 10,000 people. Fact-checkers are right to insist the government was not trying to kill drinkers, but it knew what its own policy was doing, and it continued. And then look at how Prohibition ended. Repeal came in 1933 in the depths of the Depression, and one of the loudest arguments for it was not liberty. It was revenue. Income tax receipts had collapsed with the economy, and legal drink was money the government could no longer afford to leave on the table. The United States banned alcohol when it found another way to raise money, and unbanned it when that other way failed. Same equation, different flag. In Russia, the Bolsheviks kept the ban at first. They lasted until 1925, when state sale of spirits returned, the new bottle promptly acquiring a popular nickname from the head of government of the day. The logic was identical to that of a 17th century Tsar. The country needs money, and there is no other source this reliable. In 1930, Stalin put it in writing to Molotov, arguing frankly for expanding vodka output to pay for defense and industrialization on the grounds that squeamishness was a luxury when survival was at stake. And then came 1941, and for the first time in this story, vodka stopped being merchandise. In August 1941, a State Defense Committee order introduced, from the 1st of September, a daily ration of 100 grams of vodka for troops on the front line. The rules were narrowed and rewritten several times afterwards, mostly reserving it for units on the attack. A lot of romantic literature has been written about those 100 grams, so let's be plain. Medically, it was a bad idea. Alcohol doesn't warm you. It dilates blood vessels and speeds heat loss. It doesn't supply courage. It reduces judgment and precision. Its real function was to be the cheapest available anesthetic for the nervous system of a person who was going to be sent that morning somewhere not everyone came back from. The state wasn't handing out a reward. It was handing out a painkiller. Which brings us back to Connecticut, and to the sentence that changed everything. When John Martin of Hubline bought the failing Smirnoff business in 1939, reportedly for $14,000, his own board thought he had lost his mind. He kept Kunett on the payroll with a royalty on every bottle. And then he stopped trying to sell Americans a Russian tradition. Instead, he sold them the absence of flavor as a feature. The early American positioning was extraordinary in its cheek. White whiskey, no taste, no smell. Which decoded to, drink it and nobody will know. Then came the cocktails. In the early 1940s, the Moscow Mule was born in Los Angeles. Vodka, ginger beer, and lime in a copper mug. Invented precisely to move two slow-selling products at once. The copper mug was a piece of advertising you could see from across the room. And in 1950, according to Martin's own retelling years later, bartenders marched on Fifth Avenue with a banner demanding an end to the Moscow Mule. It made the front page. Martin's people rushed in asking what to do. His answer was that it was the best thing that could have happened. Everyone who saw that banner went into a bar to find out what the drink was. Here is where the true commercial superpower of this liquid revealed itself. It has no character of its own. It mixes with everything and gets in the way of nothing. In the middle of an American cocktail boom, neutrality turned out to be the decisive competitive advantage. The numbers are almost comic. Around 40,000 cases sold in 1950. By 1955, 4.5 million. In 1967, vodka passed gin. In 1976, it passed whiskey to become the best-selling spirit in the United States, a position it held for roughly half a century. Add the movies, a certain British spy ordering his martini with vodka sold more than any advertisement ever could, and the transformation is complete. The drink that conquered the world by being almost impossible to notice. Think how strange an ending that is for a 1,000-year story. The Arab alchemist was chasing the essence of matter. The medieval physician was selling the water of life. The Russian landowner distilled 3 times and steeped it with aniseed, chasing flavor. Every one of them was fighting to put more into the liquid, and global victory went to the version with nothing left in it. The ideal 20th century vodka is the one you can't describe. No color, no smell, no character, no homeland. A pure carrier for something else. The water of life ended up as water. Just water with an effect. The Soviet Union, naturally, wasn't going to leave that market to an émigré surname. From 1972, its flagship brand got an extraordinary route into America, a barter deal with PepsiCo. The ruble wasn't convertible, and there was nothing to pay with, so payment was made in kind, Pepsi concentrate in exchange for exclusive U.S. rights to Stolichnaya. Between 1973 and 1981, something like 1.9 million decaliters of vodka crossed the Atlantic, worth around $25 million. It worked spectacularly. By 1977, the Soviet brand held something like 70% of the American imported vodka market, behind a slogan insisting that only vodka from Russia was genuine Russian vodka. Then came the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and a consumer boycott of Soviet goods. The Cold War turned out to be stronger than the marketing. That same year, a Swedish brand launched in the U.S., betting not on national origin, but on the shape of the bottle, and turned vodka advertising into an art genre. And against that backdrop came an episode that looks like a joke now and was taken entirely seriously then. A dispute over the word itself. In the late 1970s, Poland claimed priority. We were making it first, therefore the right to the name on the world market is ours. For Soviet exports, that was a threat worth millions. On the widely repeated account, Moscow handed the problem to the historian William Poklebkin, who produced a study demonstrating Russian priority, and in 1982, an international arbitration confirmed it, along with rights to the famous slogan. That story is what made his book on the history of vodka a classic. Honesty requires adding that many researchers consider the account heavily embellished by its own author, and that the procedural details don't hold up. What we most likely have is not a courtroom triumph, but a very well-written myth about one. Still, notice that the case existed at all. 2 states arguing in earnest over the ownership of a word, because by the late 20th century the name was worth more than what was in the bottle. And then comes the darkest part of this story, where it stops being about commerce and starts being about cemeteries. In May 1985, the new Soviet leadership launched an anti-alcohol campaign. The intention was sincere, and looking at the mortality figures, justified. The country was drinking catastrophically. Production was slashed, shops closed, hours restricted, prices raised, vineyards uprooted in the wine regions, toasting scenes cut out of films. Part of the effect was real. Life expectancy rose in those years, and deaths from poisoning and accidents fell. That is a fact, and it matters. Everything else followed the script you now know by heart, for the 4th time. Monstrous queues, mass illicit distilling, sugar swept off the shelves and rationed with coupons, a return to pharmacy preparations and technical fluids, and with them, the poisonings. And above all, the budget lost its habitual flow at the exact moment the oil price collapsed. The losses are estimated in the tens of billions of rubles and formed one component of a financial crisis the country never recovered from. Notice precisely what failed. The campaign attacked supply, factories, shops, opening hours, vineyards. It did almost nothing about demand. And demand stripped of a legal channel doesn't disappear. It goes where nobody is watching, and nobody answers for what's in the bottle. Every single time in this story that a state acted by prohibition, London in 1736, Petrograd in 1914, Washington in 1920, Moscow in 1985, it got the same result. Not less drinking, worse drinking. Then came the worst of it. In the early 1990s, the state monopoly was abolished, the market opened, and a torrent of cheap bulk spirit poured into the country. It was sold from kiosks, from car boots, at any hour. Backroom operations bottled whatever was available, and a bottle with a respectable label might contain technical alcohol laced with methanol. The figures need no dramatizing. Life expectancy for Russian men fell to around 57 years, a level unthinkable for a developed country in peacetime. Alcohol was not the only cause, but it was among the principal ones. Demographers called it the Russian mortality crisis. 4 centuries learning to make money from that bottle, and when the state let go of it for a decade, the bill did not arrive in rubles. Now look at where we are today. Start with the good news, which almost never gets told. From the early 2000s, Russia steadily applied the measures the World Health Organization rates as most effective. Higher excise, a minimum retail price, a ban on night sales, a total ban on spirits advertising, a state tracking system for every bottle, hard rules for drivers. The result is in a WHO report from 2019. Per capita alcohol consumption fell by about 43% between 2003 and 2016, with the sharpest drop in the unrecorded, homemade, and smuggled segment. All-cause mortality fell by roughly a third in both men and women over 15 years, and life expectancy reached a record in 2018, almost 68 for men, 78 for women. A country that spent 400 years failing to break this dependency by force moved a considerable distance using price, availability, and paperwork. Not prohibition. Regulation. The lesson Parliament had already learned and forgotten in 1751. But power over this liquid hasn't gone anywhere. It has simply changed hands again. Look at the global market. The best-selling vodka brand in the world carries a Russian surname and belongs to a British group. Its great premium rival is Swedish and belongs to a French one. Rights to the flagship Soviet brand spent decades in international litigation, and in 2022, it dropped its full name in Western markets altogether. The most Russian product on Earth has long lived as a global commodity, with almost no connection to Russia. And in the United States, something has just happened that closes this story with a perfect twist. For about 50 years, vodka was the top-selling spirit in America, and it still leads on revenue, around $7 billion in 2025. But in 2025, for the first time, it was beaten on volume by ready-to-drink canned cocktails, about 86 million cases against vodka's 72.5. Except, look at what's in the can. Most of those drinks are neutral spirit, or a malt base, plus flavoring and water. The colorless, characterless liquid didn't lose. It just stopped needing a bottle, a brand, or a name. It has become so completely a carrier that it has dissolved into other products entirely. Meanwhile, the drinkers are changing too. Younger generations across the developed world drink noticeably less spirit than their parents, and vodka is sliding from national symbol to just another line on the shelf. Underneath, though, the old mechanism still runs. The higher the excise, the more profitable the illicit bottling, and every tightening pushes some share of demand into the shadows. It's an equation with no pretty solution. Too cheap, and people die of the quantity. Too expensive, and people die of the quality. And the last thing worth understanding about this product, the medical picture has changed radically in the last 20 years. The old idea of a safe dose and the benefits of moderate drinking has not survived large-scale study. Ethanol is classified as a carcinogen, and its links to a list of cancers and to liver, heart, and vascular disease are solidly established. No strength, no purity of rectification, and no price point changes that. For 1,000 years, this drink was sold as medicine, as the water of life, as the thing that warms you, cures you, and lengthens your years. It was the longest and most successful advertising campaign in history. And it was false. Step back a moment and look at the whole thing. We're used to thinking that the great protagonists of history are the things you can't live without. Grain, salt, water, fire. Vodka isn't one of those. Your body doesn't need a gram of it. It doesn't feed you, cure you, or save you from famine. And yet for 4 centuries it held up the accounts of entire empires more reliably than gold, than land tax, than any industry. Because power doesn't only rest on what people need. It rests just as well on what people find hard to give up. Remember that the next time somebody tells you that heavy drinking is a national character. Russian, Irish, English, anyone's. Remember the tavern where serving food was forbidden. Remember the official who had to collect more than last year or answer for it himself? Remember the government that outlawed temperance societies by circular? Remember Parliament flooding London with gin to protect the price of corn? Remember Washington riding out with 13,000 men over an excise on whiskey? Remember a finance ministry rounding the strength to 40 because it made the sums easier? And then remember that the number is printed on your bottle right now as 80 proof. That isn't character, it's construction. It was built deliberately over centuries, and what sat in its foundations was never a vice. It was a budget. So the next time you see that bottle on the shelf, the most boring one, the cheapest one, the one your eye slides straight past, hold on it for a second. It looks like empty water, transparent, tasteless, meaningless. It is the most political liquid in history, and in your language, it's still called the water of life. You just spell it whiskey. If you made it this far, subscribe, as it genuinely helps the channel. And tell me in the comments which moment surprised you most. The government that banned sobriety, the gin that paid a quarter of Britain's bills, or the fact that 80 proof was set by a 19th century tax office. We have a lot more stories like this coming, and nearly all of them start in your kitchen.